Hello, my name is Catherine Pickering. I'm a professor here at Griffith University, and this is one of a series of videos that I've been producing to help people with doing literature reviews. They're common things to do, but they can be quite challenging. And this video is looking at a really simple mechanism to help you structure your literature review using a good old Venn diagram of 3 circles. Now, one of the classic things is finding out more about literature reviews. And we've got a whole lot of online support material available about a particular type of literature review method that many people are using here at Griffith, but also internationally. So please check out the Systematic Quantitative Literature Review video websites. A whole lot of material there, including this video. But in this one, I'm talking about a method that applies to nearly any type of literature review you're going to do, and also when you're writing an introduction to a paper, etc. Now, one of the big things about literature reviews is there's something that nearly every one of us have had to do in academia and often have had to do multiple times. And the reason for that is doing literature reviews is partly a process. It's about us becoming knowledgeable about a literature. It's about how we can gain an understanding of an existing literature and then know how our research can fit into that literature. But the other part of it is not just what we gain out of it by becoming knowledgeable, but producing a product. And the thing about that again is that there are multiple times in our academic lives in which we have to learn new information, a new discipline, a new literature. And part of that is not only learning it, but producing a product. And usually that's a written document, and it might be an introductory chapter to an honours or a master's or a PhD. It might be a book chapter, it might even be a full book in some cases. It might be a report for government or industry or a non-for-profit organisation or a community group. It might be the start of a grant. It's also when we're writing the start of papers, where we have to situate what we're going to do in our research in a broader literature and show how that literature fits together, what are the gaps and what we're going to do. And this gets to a really basic principle in educational theory about the relationship between thinking, knowledge production, and writing. Now, there are lots of resources about literature reviews, but one of the challenges around them is that they usually talk a lot about what a literature review should do and a little less about ideas about how to do them. But here are some useful resources that I've come across in reading mine up and developing skills in writing literature reviews and training students. And the last of the two here, the ones in bold saying Pickering, they're the literature review methods that we've developed and that we're increasingly using with our students, with other people. We're using them all around the world. So what's common to literature reviews? So we're doing them all the time and there's a lot of commonality. And the first thing is that you need to define terms. I come from a science background, so classically we do a trick where we get 2 Latin words or 2 Greek words and put them together and use them in some unique combination to mean something very specific. But in other discipline areas, it's much more useful to take common English words, so even literature review, and put them together and have a specific meaning, and particularly if you do systematic quantitative literature review, you're using 4 words there to mean a specific type of literature review of a specific approach. So in that case, there needs to be some time spent in the review defining the terms and clarifying about what's meant by them, and including if there's disagreements or debate in the literature about the use of certain terminology and their meaning. The next thing is, of course, there needs to be a justification for what's in the literature review, so what's being included, and also, of course, their justification for the omissions. It can't be everything, it can't be all literature, so what's included, what's excluded. There needs to have a clear structure, and it needs to let the reader know what that structure is. And in a traditional narrative review, this is a really important thing, because if we have 20 of us all doing a literature review, we could be taking very different structures and very different approaches to it. And so we need to say, okay, one of us might be doing a methodological, one of them might be doing a historical, one might be doing a conceptual, one might be doing a theoretical, one might be using any of these types of approaches. And even for some of them, like a theoretical, that could have a different structure by 3 or 4 people doing the same review. Then also, because we're doing literature reviews very often as a precursor to justifying research we're doing, it needs to be therefore linking the work we are going to do to the broader literature. And this is one of the hardest parts, is it's not just summarising the literature, it's actually critiquing it. It's saying what's important in the literature, what's the meaningful key points, what are the key advances, etc. So it's critiquing, it's evaluating. And where a literature is new to us, that can be really challenging. So, there's a lot of reading and rereading as we're gaining knowledge and perspective and understanding and learning ourselves, and then able to apply a more critical view as we read that literature. And then finally, of course, there's defining the gaps, what's not covered. And that can often relate to where we may want to go for our own research. Now, as I mentioned, there's a lot of literature about what a good literature review is, and this is a really nice rubric for assessing literature reviews, and this is a really good way of reminding us about what goes into a literature review. So what's the coverage? Is there well-justified criteria for inclusion and exclusion of the literature? Synthesis. Does the literature review distinguish between what's done from what needs to be done? Does it place the topic in the broader scholarly literature? Does it relate it to how it sits within disciplines and how it brings together certain ideas? Does it place it in a historical context of the field? Has the writer acquired and enhanced the subject vocabulary? So in some areas that can be quite a challenge. Has it articulated the important variables and phenomena? And has it synthesised and gained a new perspective on the literature? So if you have 20 of us all doing a literature review on a particular subject, say systematic quantitative lit reviews, have we all managed to synthesise and provide some new perspective around that literature? Then there's the methodology. Have we identified the main methods and the techniques? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of those? And associated with that, what are the related ideas and theories? Now, in some areas, there's well-accepted methodology and it's fairly straightforward to describe what's there, but in others there can be quite a lot of debate about the appropriateness of different methods and also the underlying concepts that drive those methods. Then there's the significance of the literature, and that's its practical significance of the topic. And very often people are doing research that has really important practical significance that directly affects people's lives. And then there's also the scholarly significance of the research. And then finally, of course, it has to be beautifully written, lovely coherent writing style, gorgeous, easy to read, smooth, no errors, no typos, etc. Now, at this point, most of us are feeling more depressed than excited, because that's the difficulty about a lot of the literature on literature reviews, saying, oh, it's going to be this, it's going to be fabulous, it's going to have all of this in it. But that doesn't help us then in how to do it. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to give you and go through a really simple 4-step process to help structure a literature review or an introduction to a paper, etc. And it's like, it addresses these questions, which are the ones we commonly have. So, what's my research question? What are the related broad discipline areas? And how do they fit together? What's the literature I need to read? Part of which is, when is enough enough? And why is it an important topic? And how do I structure and justify that? How do I put together the literature review? And in doing this, I'm going to use just 3 simple circles overlinking a classic Venn diagram. Now, in doing this exercise, you can use 4 or 5 or 2, but we've tended to find that 3 is the most, tends to work for many of them. And the first thing is draw the big circles, and in that area of overlap between the 3 circles, write in your research question. And this is a good, really useful exercise to repeat as you go through the process, because one of the first things is, can you articulate in a few words exactly what your research question is? If you can't, that's one of the things you then need to be working on. You haven't yet started to refine that question. Then the next step is saying, what are the broad discipline areas that it involves? And at this level, you go out quite broadly and say, like university departments or major concepts, etc. And you put those on the outside of each of the circles. So you'd put up here which ones they are and have a look at those. And then with that, you can step in around those broad discipline areas, getting closer and closer to your research question, but thinking about it. And this is, again, a really important principle about being able to locate your research really specifically in detail, but also have that broader thinking about the disciplines that it relates to. Then, what's the literature I need to read? And that gets to be, at this point, a really a way of prioritising the literature. And that is that if you come across any papers that are in that central area of the overlap, they're 3-star, they're really directly relating to your topic, they're gold. Now, unfortunately, in some cases, or fortunately, there isn't much there, which is part of one of the reasons you're doing that work, is you're going to go on and do research, is because not much is known about that topic. In some other cases, there might be a lot there, and you start to think, okay, that's really good for me to survey that literature, but I do need to be identifying some research gaps to be able to go and do novel research myself. So 3-star, really good. Then you've got to remember there are 2-star, and they're in those areas of overlaps between two of the discipline areas. And they're relevant and useful, but not quite as much as the 3-star ones. So they're good. And then there are the ones that are in only one of those broad discipline areas. And they're okay, and you're going to need to read some of them, but not all of them. You're just going to need them to give a general context for that broad discipline area. But your main reading is going to be in 3-star and some 2-star, and not very many 1-star research papers, etc. Now, that's all really good in that area of working out what to read, and that helps you work out when's enough. So you're starting to get a feel for how much literature. And these aren't hard and fast divisions, but they do give you an area and a way of prioritising the literature and starting to get a feel for it. Because the next thing is, how do you turn 3 circles into a document? Because that's the thing about it, is that we still have to produce a literature review as usually a linear written document. And that is, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So something's going to have to go first, second, third, and fourth. And in a sense, very often, if you're writing an introduction, etc., this is the beginning of the thesis, it's also what you're doing is not only summarising the literature, you are trying to justify the research that you're going to do. So it's a stepped argument, often going down to the aims of a research study or a conclusion or summary of that research, where you're going to give remember that coherent and significant synthesis or critique of it, a summary of the key points and the key outcomes of that literature. So how do you go about taking those circles and turning them into triangle? Well, one of the ways you do it is you can sit there and say, okay, I have to choose one of these broad discipline areas. And one of the ways to prioritise that is to say, okay, if this is a journal, then you'd say, which is the journal discipline I want to submit to? If it's your thesis, it's which is the broad area that I am contributing my research, which is the department I am enrolled in, the area I'm identifying with. And that would go first. And there at the beginning of it, you'd start off with some nice broad general statements about the significance of that discipline area and its importance. And that's where you'd be using some of those 1-star papers from that broad discipline area. But then what you do is say, okay, having established that's an important topic and broad statements, you then step down into the area of overlap in number 2. And that's an area between 2 of the circles where they're overlapping. And you'd start to talk about how those 2 literatures overlap and that summary around it. Then you'd go into the third point, which is the other area of overlap in those 3 circles. But again, you're now subsetting it into a smaller and more focused case of how it relates to that specific overlap between the 2 and fits together. And then number 4 is when you're hitting that sweet point of the 3-star papers and the really focused example leading to your research. Now, if you wanted to change discipline areas or you're changing the journal, you'd have to reorder them and you'd change what your broad statement was at the beginning. Because remember, one of the important things when you're writing is what's important goes first. So if it's overall for the whole area, it goes into the first paragraph. If it's important, it goes at the start of a paragraph. And if it's important, it also goes into the first words in a paragraph. And there's always this old trick. It's to see whether you can read a document just by reading the first sentences in each paragraph. And you should be able to work a line of argument and see how it's set out just from that. And in some cases, there's this challenge that you can try, which is to read the first 8 to 10 words of the first sentence and see if they've put what's important in the first paragraphs, in the first sentences, in the first 8 to 10 words of those sentences. Give it a go and see how you find it. So then when you're doing that, this is what you're going to do. You're going to have a block of text about area 1, 2, 3 and 4, but they're step down points. 1 is going to be a bit broader, but having justified 1 and its relation to 2, 2 is now a subset of 1. 3 is a subset of 2, so you don't have to talk about everything to do with that area, and 4 is a subset again. So once we've done this and done this exercise of working that sequence, then we suggest mind mapping, and that's writing out a point summary of what goes in each of those sections. And doing that, it's really important to do a word budget, which is to say, how long is the review I'm going to write? Is it a page? Is it 30 pages? Because that's going to determine how many words for each of those sections to give you an idea of the relative amount. And it'll also give you a scale to the number of papers that you're going to read and cite. So obviously, if you were doing this exercise and it was going to be 1 page, then you're not going to have 400 references in here and cite 400 of them. But if you were writing a longer document, then you might have more references, cite more of them to set the scenes and provide more nuanced argument around each of those points because they're given more time, more space, more words. So it's really important though to remember it's an argument, it's leading to a justification. It's what is the structure, what's the point, why is this significant, and how is the research you're going to do contribute to this literature and answer these important questions in the discipline. Same process, as I say, works for introductions to papers. Carefully step that argument from the most general to the most detailed, which is your aims. In my area, that's often 4 to 5 paragraphs. In some, it may be only 1 to 2 paragraphs. In others, it may be longer. It may be a couple of pages in the introduction, even to a paper. For a thesis and report, often that, of course, might again be longer. But remember, it's a stepped out argument, so everything needs to lead to the aims, and they need to be good, and they need to match what you actually did or found when you're reporting in a paper. So thanks for listening to this, and this is a background to doing literature reviews, but most of what we're working on is a particular type of literature review, and that's a systematic, quantitative type of literature review, and that's an even more structured process with really specific criteria for how you search the literature, for how you then measure or quantify the literature, and then 5 steps associated with how you write it up in the report. If you want to find out more about that, please just search for Systematic Quantitative Literature Review in Griffith. Up will come a website with a whole lot of reference material, including this and other videos, etc. And if you do end up going and using that method, please cite this paper we've written about the benefits of publishing these types of literature reviews for PhD candidates, other early career researchers, and when people are moving into new disciplines. And hopefully, this may be used soon, which is 2 of our students holding on their first publications, which were systematic quantitative literature reviews, and that have been made important contributions to their area of research and have been heavily cited. Thank you very much.